This lecture is going to introduce you to the transaction and asset demand for money and explain how the transaction of the demand and supply of money determine the interest rate in the market. Banks' balance sheets are used to explain how open market operations are effective in changing the money supply. We're also going to learn tools other than open market operation that Fed might use to manipulate the money supply in the economy. And the reason that these two are chosen. We're also going to evaluate expansionary and a restrictive monetary policy and the condition under which this policy should be used. Okay, so let's move to what we will cover throughout the chapter. So here are the content that we will cover: interest rate, consolidated balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. We're also going to explore the tools of monetary policy, the Fed target and Taylor rule, monetary policy, the real GDP, and the price level, how all three of them are related. And we will look at the big picture that will summarize all the learning, the fiscal and the monetary policy, all the learning together, and tie it back to the aggregated demand. Okay, so interest rate overview. As we define interest rate in the past, is the pair, is a price pair for the use of money. So understanding interest rate is a key economic concept. Right, so there's one example of that put forward in your learning tools is you talk about one event and what two friends are discussing their career. One told the other one that what my company will, if you invest in my company, we guarantee that will give you a higher return on investment. And the reason being that our company is around for over 100 years. And that's why we are safer and we can give you that. And the other friend, which is economist, he stopped him and say, no, the reason why your company offer a higher return on investment is because of the investment represents a higher risk for the investor. And to compensate the investor for that risk, that's why your company offer higher return on investment. So that's why it's very important that we understand interest rate and what is included into it. There are many different interest rates, but all of them speak as one interest rate and is determined by the supply of money and the demand of money when we get to that equilibrium. So the demand for money, there's two kinds of what we need money for. The first one being the transaction demand for money, denoted G sub T, and it's determined by the nominal GDP and independent of interest rate. The other one is D sub A, which is the asset demand for money, right? Money as a store of value. And that is inversely related to the interest rate. The total demand for money is the sum of the asset demand for money and the transaction demand for money. So people hold money for many reasons. One of the reasons is that it is convenient to have money available to purchase necessary goods and services. And that is referred to as the transaction demand for money, what we call DT. The second reason for holding money is the asset demand for money, or DE, right? People like to hold some of the financial asset as money because money is the most liquid asset that we have. If an emergency arises, where you need funds in a hurry, right? You will be able to have access to those funds quickly if you have a money. The disadvantage of holding money as an asset is that it's a non-productive asset. If you bury money, or you leave a pile of money under your mattress, when you go back and pull it after 10 years, it's still gonna be the same money that you put over there. But the purchasing value of that pile of money may decrease because of inflation. The purchasing value may not be the same as when you put the money over there. So the amount of money demanded as an asset is inversely related to the interest rate, right? Meaning, as the interest rate go up, the demand for money as an asset will go down, right? Because, and vice versa, because people that investor have more incentive if the interest rate is higher to keep the money in the bank and earn those interest rates instead of hold it as a store of value. The total demand for money is equal to the transaction demand for money and the asset demand for money, right? So the transaction demand for money is assumed to be vertical, as it depends on GDP rather than the interest rate. But the asset demand for money is inversely, right, related to the interest rate. So that explains the downsloping curve that we see here. And the total demand for money is the sum of the transaction demand and asset demand for money. Interest rate. Just like in other resource market, there is an equilibrium interest rate that will cause the supply of money available to equal to the demand of money. And that rate can be thought of as the market determining the price that the borrower must pay for using someone else's money over a period of time. Federal Reserve balance sheet. As any balance sheet, we have two sides of the balance sheet. The asset and in one side, and the other side we have a liability and net worth. but both sides had to be equal. I keep that in mind for any balance sheet. You had to balance it. So the total in each side of the balance sheet had to be equal. So the Federal Reserve balance sheet report asset like any other balance sheet. Report asset in one side and liability and net worth on the other side. So the Fed balance sheet help us to consider how Fed conduct monetary policy. Right. So security consists of a bond that have been purchased by Federal Reserve, and the majority of which are treasury, bills, notes, and a bond. This is an example of a consolidated balance sheet of the 12 Federal Reserve banks as of February 28, 2019 in millions. Like I said before, if you look at one side, categorize all the assets of the Fed, security, the loan to commercial bank, and all other assets. And we have a liability and net worth in the other side, a reserve that the Fed had to hold for commercial bank, treasury deposit, the Federal Reserve note outstanding, and all other liability and net worth. But the key here is the total or the subtotal on each side of the balance sheet had to be equal. This global perspective contains some example of the central bank of other nations. Right, like the Federal Reserve System, this bank coordinate the monetary policy of their countries, Australia, Canada, European Central Bank, ECB, the Bank of Japan, and so and so. The tools of monetary policy, and we will elaborate on each one of these four tools that we have over here. First one being the open market operation, the reserve ratio, the discount rate, and interest. The latest one is interest on reserve. So what is the open market operation? Open market operation are used by the Fed to increase or decrease the commercial bank reserve available, which in turn will affect the amount of money available in the economy. So this process, by selling or buying security, has expanded since the mortgage crisis of 2008. So here is the balance sheet of the Fed on the top and the commercial bank at the bottom. And this is when Fed purchased a bond from a commercial bank. So as part of the open market operation, Fed will buy or sell government security. So if they purchase government security from the commercial bank, well, like in this case over here, the commercial bank are transferring a part of their holding of security, right? They transfer the security to the Fed, and the Fed will adjust the commercial bank reserve that it holds. Right. So that will add more, that will create more or a new reserve to the bank. So the idea is by buying and moving the security from the commercial bank to the Fed, and Fed adding to the bank reserve. By increasing that bank reserve, the Fed increase the lending capability of the commercial bank, because now they have more reserve, they have more capability or ability to lend to the economy. So let's look at this example here, this scenario when the Fed purchased a government bond from commercial bank, increases the asset of the Fed, and also increases the reserves of the commercial bank. And this will give more ability to the commercial bank to lend to the economy. Right. So in our case here, we have a simple scenario of 1,000 excess reserve, right? That the Fed purchase a bond, $1,000 bond from a commercial bank, and adjust the commercial bank reserve accordingly. Right, so now the commercial bank will have that excess reserve that they will use to lend to the economy, and the multiplier will work to magnify this $1,000 and the banking system as a whole, because of this injection or this increase in the new reserve, or this new reserve of 1,000 will generate 5,000 in the banking system. So here we look at it clearly here, right? The check is deposit, the check is deposit. If when the Fed purchases government bond from the public, the first one is they get it straight from the commercial bank, and the adjustment is through the reserve. So here, if the Fed purchases the government bond from the public, right? So it will generate a check, and the public or the consumer will deposit the check into the account. It will have the same effect as if Fed purchases it from a commercial bank directly. Right. So the asset of the Fed gonna increase, and as the public deposit the fund into the commercial bank, that will increase the commercial bank lending ability. Right. So in this case over here, you deposit the $1,000 to the first bank, and the bank are required to put, in our example here, 20% on the side. So they have excess reserve of 800. This excess reserve of 800, the bank can lend it out. So if you lend it to consumer A also can put it in his own bank, and that bank are required to put a reserve on the side, and the rest will have excess reserve that they can also lend to the public. So by keep doing it in and out, you will see that the $1,000 original check, fund, and deposit will generate throughout the entire bank system additional $4,000, and the total increase of the money supply will be $5,000, original $1,000 plus the first excess reserve, what the first excess reserve generated through the money multiplier. So if the Fed sell government bond to or commercial bank, the opposite effect will happen. The bank will lose reserve, which will reduce the lending ability. So whether the Fed sell bond to the public or the commercial bank, the result is the same. When the Fed sells security on the open market, commercial banks reserve are reduced. If all excess reserve are already lent out, this decline in the commercial bank reserve produce a decline in the nation money supply. By using repo and reverse repo, the Fed can also manipulate the money supply. When the Fed makes the repo transaction, the money supply is increased, and the reverse repo will decrease, will do the inverse. It will decrease the money supply. So the repo, what is a repo transaction? Is a loan in exchange of a guarantee. Here is a change for government bond that they use as a collateral or to the loan. So once the loan comes to term and you pay the loan back, you get your security. And the reverse repo is the inverse of the repo. The second element is the reserve ratio. In addition to open or market operation, the Fed has 3 other tools available. The Fed can change the reserve ratio, which will affect the ability of the commercial bank to lend money to the economy. If the reserve ratio is increased, the money multiplier will decrease, because we know the money multiplier is the inverse of the reserve ratio. So M is equal 1 divided by the R, which is the reserve ratio. As the lender of last resort, the Fed makes short-term loan to bank to cover unexpected or immediate need for additional funds. And the rate that the Fed charge the bank is called the discount rate. When they make those short-term loan to the commercial bank, they charge them the discount rate. Right. And since they are not required reserve against loan from Fed, any new reserve are considered as excess reserve. Anytime the loan comes from the Fed to the commercial bank are not required, as in the case of checkable deposit, they are not required to put a reserve. So whatever money they got from the Fed become excess reserve, and that increase the lending ability. So if the Fed raises the discount rate, discourage bank from borrowing money, and if the Fed lower the rate, they encourage a bank to borrow money. The term auction facility is another way that the Fed can alter with the bank reserve. So twice a month, what the Fed will do twice a month, the Fed auction of the right for the bank to borrow a reserve for a period of 28 or 84 days period. So these two allow a Fed to guarantee that the amount of a reserve that the bank which to borrow. Right, it guaranteed them that whatever they wish to lend will be borrowed. So this table shows that a change in the reserve ratio affect the money creating ability of the banking system as a whole. Right. So change the amount of the excess reserve, or we change the size of the multiplier. So if we look at this table, for instance, where we have the reserve ratio here, the first one be 10%, second 20%, 25%, 30%. So here are the checkable deposit. So you have the actual reserve of 5,000. So the required reserve, if the ratio is 10% and the checkable deposit is 20,000, that means that the required reserve is 2,000. So if you take the 2,000 out of for the actual reserve, you have the excess reserve that the bank have available to lend to the economy. Right. And as we say before, the multiplier is equal 1 over the reserve ratio. So in our case here, the multiplier will be 1 divided by 10%, which will give you 10. So we have the excess reserve of 3,000 that we inject back into the economy, and the multiplier going to magnify this initial injection. And for the banking system as a whole, we have a potential money creation of 30,000. Okay, so try to do the rest. So the second row, the third row, and the fourth. The discount rate. As the lender of last resort, Fed makes short-term loan to commercial bank to cover any unexpected or immediate need of additional funds. And the rate they charge for those overnight loan is called the discount rate. Interest on reserve. In 2008, the federal law was changed so that the Fed could, for the first time, pay bank interest on excess reserve. So the idea for the Fed is by changing the interest rate, the Fed can encourage or discourage bank to keep reserve, thereby influencing the amount of lending that bank do. So in 2000, during the 2018, the interest rate on excess reserve averages 1.9%, and the bank held about 1.8 trillion in excess reserve at the Fed. So you see, it's a big dollars. Here we're going to summarize the tools, the 4 different tools that we cited before. So the open market are the most important tools in Federal Reserve Bank arsenal. It gives the Fed a flexibility in controlling the money supply in the economy. The other tools, right, are typically used in special circumstances. For example, the reserve ratio. The last time the reserve ratio was changed was in 1992. And was done more to shore up a bank and thrift in the aftermath of 1990-1991 recession. In 2008, the federal law was changed so that the Federal Reserve could, for the first time, pay bank interest on excess reserve. By doing so, the Fed can want to be able to encourage or discourage the bank to keep reserve and eventually manipulate the supply of money in the economy. So what is the aim of the Fed? What is the mandate for the Fed? Congress give the Fed two different objectives. But the first one being make sure that we have a full employment in the labor force, and the second one being a stable price in the economy, guarantee a stable price in the economy. So those are the dual objective or mandate that was given to the Fed by Congress in 1977. So to carry out these two objectives, which is achieving full employment and unemployment rate between 4 to 5%. For Fed, they target the unemployment to be 4 to 5%, while at the same time maintaining the target rate of inflation currently around 2%. So these two targets are determined by the Fed based on the current economic condition. One thing I want to point out here, the target for unemployment rate factor the frictional and the cyclical unemployment, and what the target for inflation rate, right, balances the desire to allow for growth while keeping prices stable on the market. The Fed overall goal is to comply with the dual mandate given to them by Congress. And the dual mandate state that the Fed main objective should be to help the economy achieve a full employment and a stable price. like I said before, to do that, they target the goal of achieving full employment, right, full employment, an employment rate between 4% and 5%, right, while at the same time maintaining a target rate of inflation currently set around 2% per year. And these two targets are determined by the Fed based on the current economic condition. Other thing equal, Fed will be more inclined toward restrictive monetary policy if the actual inflation rate as measured by the CPI, Consumer Price Index, is above the target rate, or the actual unemployment rate fall below the target rate. And Fed will be more inclined toward expansionary monetary policy if the actual inflation is below the target, or if the unemployment rate is above the target. And like I said before, the target unemployment rate factor in frictional and cyclical unemployment, while the target inflation rate balances the desire to allow for growth while keeping prices stable and interest rate above zero to prevent people from pulling deposit from the bank. So this chart illustrates a dual mandate. So the closer the Fed can get to hitting the center of the bull eyes here, the closer it is to achieving the dual mandate, right? Unemployment rate for a little over 4%, and the inflation rate being at 2%. Taylor rule. Taylor rule was developed by economist John Taylor, and it is built upon the theory that central banks are willing to tolerate a small positive inflation rate if doing so help the economy to achieve its potential output. Taylor rule assumed that the Fed has a 2% target inflation rate and follow three basic rules when setting its target for the federal fund rate. The first rule is when the real GDP is equal to potential GDP and the inflation rate is at the target of 2%, the federal fund rate should be at 4%. The second rule is that for each 1% increase in real GDP above potential GDP, the Fed should raise the real federal fund rate by a half percentage point, a 0.5%. And three, for each 1% increase in the inflation rate above the 2% target, Fed should raise the real federal fund rate by 0.5%. That is a Taylor rule. And the rule is the rule of thumb that Fed used until today. So Here are some of the clarification. The inflation gap is equal to the current actual rate of inflation minus the 2% target set by the Fed. And the unemployment gap here is the current unemployment rate minus the 4.3% target rate that Fed set up. Federal fund rate. So interest rate that is charged on the federal fund market. So, and it's those overnight loan that the bank make available. If a bank have excess reserve, they make that available to the bank in need to for emergency fund in need of reserve. So they go to the federal fund market to make those loans, and the interest charge is called the federal fund rate. Instead of leaving excess reserve at the Federal Reserve Bank, which typically pay less interest than commercial bank. So when commercial bank have excess reserve, they will prefer to loan them to other banks that are temporary in need of money to meet their own reserve requirement, right? And the rate change, like I said before, is called the federal fund rate. And that serves as the equilibrium rate for this market of the bank reserve. Federal Reserve target this rate by manipulating the supply of a reserve that are offered on the market. Typically, this is done through buying or selling government security. So the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, meets regularly to choose a desired federal fund rate and then direct the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to undertake open market operation needed to achieve that target. So how the whole thing is related: monetary policy, real GDP, and price level. So the next section will discuss how monetary policy affect economic level of investment, aggregated demand, GDP, and price. This graph illustrates the demand for the investment demand in B and the market for money in A. So an expansionary monetary policy is shift the money supply curve in A over here. It shift the money supply to the right row, right? So you can see that SM1, SM2, SM3. So the expansionary policy will shift the money supply to the right. And doing so, you will see that the interest rate, it will put the downward pressure on the interest rate from 10 to 8 and to 6, right? And from 10 to 8 will result over here, if you look at the graph B, it result in investment spending that increased from 15, right, at 10% is at 15. But since we have more demand for supply for money shift railroad, so put the downward pressure on the interest rate now allow the investment spending to shift from 15 billion to 20 billion, right? And we know that the investment demand is one of the components of the aggregated demand. And once you increase it, the multiplier will work to add more to the output produced, to magnify the output produced. So let's look at another graph. And this is, again, the expansionary monetary policy is shown in the graph on the previous slide, right? Cause the aggregated demand to increase. Right, so the I shift up from 15 to 20 billion. That will cause the aggregated demand to shift up. Right, so the aggregated demand shifts up. So originally, the I was at 15. And once now the I is at 20, you see that the aggregated demand position shifts up. So now we have the output produced, which is QF, 900 billion. They shift from 880 to 900 billion. Okay, conversely, if you look at this graph, conversely, a restrictive monetary policy will cause the money supply curve to shift leftward, right? It will reduce to shift leftward, right? Thereby, that will increase the interest rate. That will increase the interest rate and decreasing the investment and the aggregated demand. So indeed, the economy at this equilibrium A, right, has an inflationary output gap, right? Because we have the potential output 900, but we are here at 910 billion. Right, so to close this gap, this inflationary gap, so the economy will undertake a restrictive monetary policy, and that policy will cause the money supply curve to shift leftward and increase the interest rate and decrease investment, and ultimately the aggregated demand will decrease. We're going to bring it back here. And we already talked about also the ratchet effect of the price, and the price doesn't come down, right? You have the price. So when it push back, it's gonna decline, the aggregated demand the multiplier, the initial reduction will be magnified by the multiplier and reduce the gap that we have over here. Right, the inflationary output gap, it will correct it and bring it back to 900. So expansionary monetary policy. During the time of recession and unemployment, the Fed will initiate expansionary monetary policy. The idea is to increase the supply of money in the economy in order to increase borrowing and spending. One of the problems that hinder the recovery following the last recession, the 2007-2008 2009 recession was that while spending increases, the borrowing went down. And when people save instead of borrowing money. And that can be actually detrimental for the economy. Saving being a leakage, right, to the spending stream of the economy. Restrictive monetary policy. Again, the period it happened, Fed undertake restrictive monetary policy during a period of rising inflation. During rising inflation, Fed will shift to a more restrictive monetary policy in order to keep the price down. Fed will increase the interest rate, right, to reduce the borrowing and spending in the economy, which will hopefully slow the expansion of aggregated demand that is driving the price higher in the economy. So now let's see the policy and see the problem and all the action and the flow of event that will happen to correct the gap. So this chart illustrates the cause and effect of expansionary monetary policy. When the economy is faced with a problem of unemployment and recession, the Fed take action to increase the money supply, right? So people can have the easiness to borrow money and invest it into the economy to push the economy out of a recession. And doing so, the aim is eventually help the economy to increase the real GDP. Okay, so problem, unemployment, recession, Federal Reserve buy bonds or security, can lower the reserve ratio, lower the discount rate, reduce interest on reserve, right? Or initiate a repo. Right, so excess reserve doing all these things, the excess reserve of the commercial bank will increase, right? The federal fund rate will fall, and the money supply in the economy will rise. Interest rate will fall. Investment spending gonna increase, but people are gonna have the easiness to borrow money and invest it. And ultimately, the aggregated demand will increase and GDP will rise. So in the other end, the cause effect chain during a restrictive monetary policy. So it happened in time of inflation. The Fed practices restrictive monetary policy, and it decreased the money supply in the economy, which will lead to a decrease in the inflation rate. But one thing we need to keep in mind here, because prices in the market tend to be inflexible downward, if the Fed is not careful, the action can lead to a recession. So they have to take that in consideration, that on the market, the prices have that ratchet characteristic, right? It doesn't flex down. So they have to take that in consideration before they kick in the restrictive monetary policy, so they don't overshoot it. Because if you overshoot it, eventually, instead of stopping the inflation, you end up creating a recession. Compared to fiscal policy, which involve the government changing the tax and the spending policy, monetary policy have several advantages. It can quickly be changed to fit the current economic condition. And because the member of the Fed Board of Governors serve a fixed term and are not appointed, not elected, they are not subject to the political pressure that the elected officials are subject to. So they are more objective to carry out the duty, more free of pressure, we say. So given the fact that the recession was declared, the last recession was declared to have officially ended in June 2009, many economists continue to debate whether the Fed action helped or hindered the recovery of the economy. Over the past decade, the Fed has acted to attempt to stimulate the economy, even lowering the federal fund rate to almost zero. So here's some of the things to know that we get from after the recession. So to help us stimulate the economy after the Great Recession, the Fed implemented the zero interest rate policy, quantitative easing, operation twist, and full guidance. So under the, like cover the first one. So under the zero interest rate policy, the Fed aimed to keep short-term interest rate near zero to stimulate the economy. When growth remained weak, the Fed had to find a way to deal with the zero lower bound policy, under which a central bank is constrained in his ability to stimulate the economy through a lower interest rate, since he cannot have a zero or less than zero or a negative interest rate. So the next response was quantitative easing. And the quantitative easing is similar to open market operation, but it's not intended to lower interest rate because the interest rate is already close to zero. The objective is stimulate increase the lending in the economy. So in the second round, the Fed engaged in a forward commitment. And the forward commitment is pre-announcing exactly how much the Fed was going to buy, how much of the security the Fed was going to buy. Starting in summer 2017, Fed began to sell the huge pile of financial asset that he had accumulated during the recovery. Problem and complication of monetary policy. The lags that we discussed before complicate monetary policy because although its impact is faster than fiscal policy, there's still a 3 to 6 month delay that can cause the problem to be worse, and also the result in Fed overshooting his target. Economists maintain that monetary policy is more effective in dealing with a slowing expansion and controlling inflation than helping the economy recover from a severe recession, right? Why? Because even though Fed may create excess reserve during recession for commercial bank, that does not mean that the commercial bank will actually loan the money out. That's why in the recent recessionary period, United States focused more on the use of fiscal policy in attempting to spend spend more money and push the economy out of a recession. So the big picture, so this figure illustrates the big picture and the many concepts and principles that we discussed throughout the semester, and how they all related to one another. You will see that the price level, the output, price level, output, unemployment, income, right? All the result from the interaction between the aggregated supply and the aggregated demand. Yeah. And end up giving the output, the level of output, unemployment, income, and prices on the market.